Hey traders, Marcello here, founder of the Day Trading Academy. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week. Absolutely crazy week, up and down markets. They had the worst markets almost on record on Monday due to the crash in Japan. Warren Buffett sells the most stock in any quarter, last quarter. And also some interesting news about the climate front. We're having record cold temperatures, in addition to another study talking about how you can avoid dementia in more than 50% of cases. Let's go and get started. Absolute roller coaster of a week for the markets. On Monday, everything absolutely crashed. Japan had the worst point the total going down in history, meaning that it wasn't a record by percentage, but it was a record in points. It was the end of the world. Everything was going wrong. And then on Tuesday, everything just came back and everything's fine. And now the stocks at the end of the week are positive, including the Communist Republic of Canada. And now everything's going to go fine. Everything's going to go along just fine. U.S. stocks did have its worst session in 2 years, and one of the things that I wanted to explain is why this happened, because I think it's important to, outside to prepare for the end of the world, obviously, to understand how everything is connected, because in these situations of crisis, especially when there's big drops in the market or, big spikes or movements, whenever there's a crisis, that's the best time to make money. So just FYI. So there's something called the Japan carry trade, and I'm going to bring this all the way back to 1998, 1999. The dot-com bubble bursted. It was kind of like a mini financial collapse compared to the major collapse that we had in 2008 and 2009. There was a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management that basically failed, and because they were so big and they were so involved, they had their tentacles all over the market. The market, meaning that the central banks in the United States and Europe, decided to bail out this fund rather than letting it fail. So they passed all these poisonous, let's call it assets, onto other parts of the financial system rather than just keeping it inside this hedge fund and suffering through the damage and then recovering. Kind of like what Iceland did in 2008 and 2009, where they didn't bail out their banks, they let them fail, and then they recovered very nicely after that. So 1998, 99, we had that hedge fund collapse. The markets, the central banks basically bailed them out. Then in 2008 and 2009, we had the GFC, the great financial collapse in our history. We had, for those of you guys that are younger that don't know about this, entities like Bear Stearns that's been around for 100 years, financial entity, went bust, and they had even more tentacles into the market. So at that point, basically, the market was going to completely eat itself and the world was going to end, essentially. So due to 2008 and 2009, because of how bad it was, most countries around the world, especially more industrialized, let's call them quote-unquote advanced countries, decided to drop their interest rates to the lowest in recorded history. Not the history of the United States, but the history of the world. So what happens? When we talk about economies, the U.S. being the largest economy in the world, they have about almost 70% consumer spending of the economy, right? 70% of the economy is you and I going out and spending money. Second largest economy in the world, China, if I'm not mistaken, they're about 50. Germany, third largest economy in the world, they're almost at 50. Japan, fourth largest economy in the world, they're almost at 50 as well, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, what this means that the majority of the economy around the world is basically you and I going out and spending money. So the central banks decided to go out and lower the interest rates to recorded levels, just, basically absolutely to the floor. And then everybody started going out and buying stuff. And that moved the economy, because instead of buying a house, for example, that we have now at 6-7%, buying a house at 2-3%, you could probably buy 2-3 houses with the same amount of money you can use to buy a house now at 6-7%. Outside of the appreciation of the homes. So due to that situation, Japan has a very unique situation where they've been stuck in what's called stagflation, not stagflation, deflation, I guess you can call it. But basically, they have been in this low interest rate environment for decades because the government is basically borrowing its own money. They own over 50% of all their debt. Literally, the government owns its own debt. They don't have the pleasure of having the US dollar that runs the world, basically, where other people buy the US dollar, right? They're more of a smaller economy compared to the US, and so they can't do the same thing as the US. So they've been buying their own debt and keeping the interest rates low on purpose to be able to continue the charade, and they decided to raise the interest rates. So what happens? There's something called the Japan carry trade, where basically people go out and trade money. They borrow money in yen, right, at 1%, really, really low rates. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. Then they take this money on the loan that they're paying for in yen at the almost 0% interest rates, and they go and invest it somewhere else and make money on the difference. So it's kind of like I take out the money in yen, I pay 0% interest, and then I go to the US Treasury market and I get paid 3, 4, 5%. So once Japan raised the interest, then people couldn't make those payments. They couldn't service the debt anymore. And then something called a margin call happens, where people borrow the money. They normally have to give collateral, and a lot of times that's stocks, gold, silver, whatever their financial positions are. And due to the fact that they can't afford to finance the Japanese yen loan, then they have to liquidate everything else that they put up as collateral. Ergo, the crash that we had on Monday. Now, they kind of walked this back in terms of the interest rates, and this might not be the last thing, the last thing that happens in regards to this, because, for example, I've talked before about the commercial real estate crisis, where U.S. banks, European banks, a lot of Western, quote-unquote, Western, Japanese, Australian, a lot of these banks are invested in commercial real estate, these towers that have offices, and nobody wants these towers anymore, and they're selling at 90, 100% discounts, basically. And so when that loan is due, all these banks are going to have to take those loans as a loss, which means they don't have the money to cover the loans. Just another example of the kind of situation we're in financially, because we're literally walking into another one of these crises. So that's basically what happened this week. The Magnificent Seven in the United States, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Facebook, all the good ones, they lost over $500 billion in market cap, the worst day in trading since 1987. And as I mentioned, as of Tuesday, markets recovered, ended up positive. Everything is fine. Let me know if you like that explanation, because I think it's important. That's kind of why I do these videos, so you guys can connect the dots and obviously prepare for the end of the world. Climate hysteria news. The Great Barrier Reef sees a third record year of coral growth. I'm for the environment. The hotel that I'm building in Colombia, for example, if one of the workers cut off a limb on a tree, I charge them for it, right? But I think it's kind of unusual that they've been blaming humans and the use of oil and carbon and everything, that the Great Barrier Reef was dying, and now all of a sudden it's growing for 3 years in a row, and we're using more oil and carbon. So it doesn't make sense to me what the situation is. The mainstream media also is absent in reporting dozens of nighttime low temperatures across the U.S. and Canada. Over 30 cities are experiencing weather that they would normally experience in October. And one of the things that was interesting also is they don't explain things like the Tonga volcano. We had a lot of volcano activity that spews, obviously, carbon and other things into the stratosphere. And it kind of works as a... I forgot the name of the gardening tool, but it works as a warming effect. And the Tonga volcano explosion put 10% of the water already into the atmosphere. It exploded and left that into the atmosphere. So we had, all the material and the water that we have in the atmosphere. This one explosion exploded 10% of the water vapor that we have in the atmosphere already, which could probably explain some of the warming, but they don't talk about that either. So just pointing out facts. California rocked by the 5th earthquake in 48 hours, all about 3.0s. Remember what I told you guys about the earthquake that's coming in California? It's going to be devastating. Hopefully I'm wrong, but we'll see what happens. And one of the things in another study that was really interesting is nearly half of the dementia cases could be prevented or delayed based on your lifestyle. Now, there was 12 things that they listed, but since, we're suffering from a dementia and a crisis of losing memory in the United States and around the world, should probably look that study up, because I thought it was really interesting. Overseas market news. As I mentioned, Japanese stocks absolutely were collapsing on Monday, even though they recovered. European markets ended mixed. The Istanbul markets were the biggest negative there. Latin America was mostly mixed as well. The Bovespa, the largest market in the region, and a lot of Latin America went up almost 4%. Africa and the Middle East was mixed. Saudi Arabia was the biggest loser there. And then the far East, Asia, Australia, that area, the coast being South Korea and Singapore were the biggest losers there. Bitcoin and crypto. Bitcoin, due to the crash on Monday, fell below 48,000 for the first time since February. It did, however, recover and ended up negative for the week, 2.50%. As of Saturday, it's kind of hovering around 58 to 61,000 or so. So I average that out to about 60,000 or so. Commodities and energy, crude oil prices are at 8-month lows, although for the week, U.S. crude went up 4.51% to 76.84, while Brent went up almost 4% to 79.66. Aramco, which is the Saudi state oil company, had $29.1 billion in net profit in the 3 months in quarter two. That's a 3% drop from the period last year. That's one of the things I think is funny when people think Elon Musk is rich. These guys making $29 billion in profit and they literally own the company. It's like, you guys don't know what rich is until you know Saudi and Dubai and Qatari royalty and Putin probably as well. Natural gas prices in Europe climbed to a new high in 2024. Not good for the economy in Europe since they're already kind of crawling along. CME, which is the futures exchange in Chicago, cattle futures plunged sharply after new feeder contracts are sitting at new lows. It signals a weak U.S. economy due to the fact that because consumers aren't going to go out and spend money on high-priced beef, that means that overall, remember, the United States economy is almost 70% consumer spending, could affect quite a bit the economy overall. And a record maple syrup harvest isn't enough for the top producing region in the world in Quebec. Quebec actually produces 72% of the world's supply. So you might want to check if that's real because, kind of like what happens with olive oil, there isn't enough olive oil production in the world to produce all of the olive oil that's sold. So I don't know if they mix it with something they shouldn't, but keep that in mind. And many analysts are predicting gold prices to continue to increase, especially with the expectation of the central bank rate cuts in the United States. But in other news, the central banks around the world bought a record amount of gold in the first 6 months of 2024, 483 tons. So they expect it to continue to hit record highs. Remember, gold already this year has hit multiple record highs. Gold for the week went down 0.50% to $2,431.70, while my favorite market, the silver market, went down by over 4% to $27.84. Financial and banking news, as I mentioned, Warren Buffett sold the highest amount of stock in a quarter than his entire history last quarter. And what I always tell you guys to remember is remember, it's not what they say, it's what they do. Why are all these rich people selling their stocks right now? Bond traders are now pricing the U.S. rate cut on the market as well. They're betting the Fed is going to need to lower rates aggressively to be able to spur the U.S. economy conveniently just in time for the election because obviously they have an election to win. And India held rates at 6.5% on Thursday, the 9th straight meeting where they held it the same, in line with analyst expectations. Economic news, the U.S. unemployment continued to tick upwards, 4.3% compared to 4.1% in June. Unemployment claims rose to 352,000. And if you include the discouraged and the underemployed, meaning people that are working part-time jobs but they need a full-time job, for example, the actual rate is 7.8%. And just to give you an idea, between 1942 and 1944, those 52 years, it's never been this high, which means that the unemployment is extremely high right now, and we have an historically weak labor market, which implies a not very bueno economy. Change in unemployment in 2023, new foreign-born workers rose 1.3 million, while native-born workers in the U.S. have lost 1.2 million jobs. China grew much more slowly in quarter two than expected because of the deflationary pressures and the protracted property slump. Remember that in the Chinese market, the majority of people have their pension and savings in the real estate market. And if they're almost 50% in consumer spending, that means that People don't want to go out and spend money because they feel like they're poor because their housing prices have gone down. The service sector in China, however, did expand at a faster pace in July for the 19th straight month. And the U.S. service sector expanded for the fastest than expected in July as well. So some positive economic news, even though the overall economic news isn't doing that well. Political news, the new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, condemned what he described as far-right thuggery and stated that perpetrators are going to be facing the full force of the law. Violent protesters across the UK after 3 girls were killed with a knife attack at a children's dance class. So officially, the UK has converted into the Communist Republic of the UK. They're literally jailing people more for things they say online than in Russia. They even said that they want to jail Elon Musk for the memes that he's posted on X Twitter. Crazy world. Vice President Kamala Harris chose her running mate, Vice President to be running Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, first elected to Congress in 2006, and he served as a House rep for 12 years. And even Chilean's President Gabriel Boric, which is a communist, he doesn't even recognize Maduro as the rightful president of Venezuela. Argentina, Guatemala, and Peru also joined the club. Unfortunately, there's a lot of fraud, a lot of people getting very hurt. But what's going on in Venezuela now, even though most of you in the U.S. kind of don't know, they were one of the most prosperous countries in the hemisphere, very rich country, started voting for socialism, essentially, under Chavez because of income inequality. And now they have an 80% poverty rate. So what I tell, because obviously I do all these videos in Spanish, and when I tell them, and I want to share with you, is they did vote for a socialist, the left, in legally without fraud, thinking that things were going to get better. So keep that in mind when you're voting. At the end of the day, I try to be apolitical. I think both at the end of the day, they're even whether it's the right or the left, I think they're both driving the car off the cliff. I think one's driving the car slower than the other. But at the end of the day, they're both corrupt. And I think that what we need to do is try to choose the party that opts for lower taxes and lower size of government, because the less government we have, the less corruption we can possibly have, right? Intel and corporate news went down by over 6% on Monday. Their shares tumbled 26% on Friday. The stock is now down 42% over the last month due to the fact that they're not doing very well financially. They're planning to announce 15% to cut their workforce by 15%. Uber went up by 11% after they hit their numbers and exceeded expectations. They made $10.7 billion in revenue. Their stock is up over 6% in 2024. Airbnb dropped by the most ever. Scandalous title, because they've only been a public company since 2020. They went down over 13%, earnings mixed expectations, and they're warning that they're seeing signs of slowing demand in U.S. consumers. The revenue did increase by 11%. Net income is down 15% from last year. And Rivian, they collapsed over 7% as well due to the fact that they just keep losing more money. Now they're at $1.5 billion almost in quarter two, so they're obviously not doing very well. Technology, Samsung Electronics rose over 3% after they reported their new 8-layer chips can be used by NVIDIA to put into their AI processors. They're still down about 11% for the year. And in international events, after a sweltering hottest July observed in modern history, China has been having some recorded heat events. 41.9 degrees Celsius, 107.4 Fahrenheit, historical high on August 3rd, and has been hovering around 40 degrees Celsius or about 104 degrees Fahrenheit in various parts of the country. That's your news for this week, guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember, the preppers were right.